Welcome back everybody to another MOTOBOB video, and today some very interesting new spy shots just landed in my inbox, which appear to show the next generation of Norton sports bike. And there are some significant changes here versus the V4 SV that went before it that I think could make it a more competitive proposition when you set it against some of the other premium big sports bikes like the Ducati Panigale V4 or the BMW S1000 RR. So in this video we'll go through all of the details with the 6 key areas that you need to know about. First up though, well, how do we know that this is the new Norton sports bike? Well, for starters, you've got that chrome clutch cover on the side there, which does look rather familiar, despite having the Norton logo taped up, which, you know, they didn't really think they could fool us that easily, did they? On top of that though, Norton have completely cleared out their Instagram account recently. I guess a fresh start under relatively new ownership, and they've just added one post which is a slightly mysterious shot of a tail light, and it's accompanied by the caption, "Norton's resurgence, a new era begins. Want to be the first to find out? Link in bio." So naturally, being a proactive guy, I followed the link and it takes you to a part of their website where you can sign up for updates, and it's got the date as well of 4th of November 2025. I don't think it's any coincidence that that's the first day of EICMA in Milan, which for anyone who doesn't know is the biggest trade show of the motorcycling calendar. And the first day is the press day, which is pretty much when all the new bikes are announced. The website then goes on to say something extraordinary is happening, engineering that only happens when heritage meets tomorrow, the next chapter in Norton's long story, with a twist in the tail. And speaking of tail, that picture of a tail light that's on that picture on their Instagram, well, it does look pretty familiar, so I think there's pretty much no doubt that these pictures show a bike that's due to be launched in about 5 months' time. Now, given what I said about that clutch cover, it does seem as though this new bike will indeed use the V4 that powered the previous gen V4 SV, and with no fairings on this particular test bike, if you compare it with the engine cases on the V4 CR, which was the naked version of the SV, then they are pretty much exactly the same. So assuming they've not really changed any of the fundamentals, I think it's fair to say it'll probably be a 1200cc 72 degree V4 with about 185 horsepower peak at 12,000 RPM and 125 Newton meters of peak torque at 9,000 RPM. Now, I never got a chance to ride that previous gen V4 SV. I did get offered to go to Goodwood, but at the time, I thought it wasn't worth the trip. Maybe I should have done that. But they did host a track press event a year or two back, and from what I've read, the general consensus was that it's a fairly pleasant engine, especially since TVS had ironed out some of the technical issues versus the previous owners. I will say though, that peak power figure versus the Ducatis and the BMWs and that sort of thing, well, it is about 30 horsepower down. And whilst I don't particularly think that anyone can realistically use that sort of power, even on the track, never mind the road, well, when you're paying 25 grand or 30 grand or even 40 grand for a bike, you probably want something that's got a very braggable spec. And so perhaps this new iteration could potentially up the ante a bit. I guess we'll find out at EICMA. Now, some of the chassis has indeed been carried over. Those red forged OZ racing wheels will look familiar, for example, and the beautifully sculpted single-sided swing arm. But otherwise, there are some pretty substantial changes, like, for example, the frame. The V4 SV, you see, had a tubular aluminium frame, which did look spectacular in the polished finish, but this new one appears to have a cast aluminium frame with more modern angular shapes. Now, perhaps this allows Norton to better tune the rigidity and weight of the frame, and one assumes, especially if they finish it in black like this, that it'll be a bit more efficient to make. But I think, realistically, primarily it will be about those handling benefits, which might come as a result of getting Brian Gillen as their CTO or Chief Technology Officer, who spent the last 15 years developing many of the big models at MV Agusta. Most of those have a very sporty intended use, I think it's fair to say, and so you'd imagine he'd have a thing or two to contribute in terms of the bike's handling. Elsewhere, it looks like it'll get a semi-active fork, with this shot showing the cables going into the top, and so perhaps a bit of an upgrade over the previous generation's mechanical Olin setup, allowing the bike to constantly adjust damping in real time for the optimal settings for a given surface or riding style. Then the brakes too. These are Brembo's latest high pure calipers, which you don't see on many bikes. I think you can get them on the Panigale V4S, for example, but not many since that. And they're said to have even better performance versus the likes of Brembo's previously top-of-the-line style Emmas. And so they've really gone for it in terms of premium levels of hardware here, and so probably expect premium levels of price. I think they've done a great job here though on the looks, because while the V4SV certainly stood out from the crowd, I will say the front end always just looked a little bit sad to me, like it was feeling a bit under the weather. This new design, perhaps it isn't quite so distinctive. It could easily be mistaken for an iteration of the Panigale family, or maybe it has a bit of S1000RR about it, but I do think it looks meaner and leaner and more aggressive, and for me, all the better for it. Of course, we have no side panels on this test bike, so it's hard to get a full idea of how it's going to look. But I do also really like the look of that tail light. Fantastic piece of design if you ask me. And so once it's all painted up, presumably it'll be available in black and their signature silver, then I do think it's going to make for one sweet looking machine. It's hard to get a real idea of what the ergonomics will be exactly like from these pictures because the rider's fairly sat up, and also we've got no clean shots of the bike. But surely the Panigale V4 could be viewed as one of its closest competitors, and if you line it up in Photoshop and slap it over this side-on pic of the Norton, well, you do have contact points that are reasonably similar, so I think it's fair to say this is going to be a fairly aggressive, sporty riding position, although I will say the seat does look a little bit lower on the Norton. Perhaps this method of gauging the ergonomics isn't 100% accurate, but the pegs look significantly lower too, and so that would follow on from the last generation of V4SV, which they did pitch more of as a balanced sports bike for the road, whereas a lot of the immediate competition, like the Panigale, are marketed very much as track bikes. I'd say that's probably a good thing. I don't see that many of these being taken to the track and given a good thrashing. It's just probably going to be too expensive. And the Panigale, which I tested out fairly recently, well, I wouldn't say it's exactly the sort of bike that you'd want to cruise around on the road all day. Now, tech was an area in which the last V4SV was criticized in some of those reviews, with fairly rudimentary traction control, for example, according to the MCN write-up. So while we can't see the exact details here, hopefully some of this stuff gets sorted out. And whilst new owners TVS won't necessarily bring loads of expertise in terms of superbike electronics, you'd imagine that this is probably an area in which Brian Gillen will bring over some more knowledge from MV Agusta. The last gen also had this quite odd feature, a rear-facing camera that you could pull up on the dash to use as a sort of mirror. And so any kind of more quirky features like that, I'd assume are probably going to be dropped. What I don't have any kind of idea of though is that teaser on the website which said the next chapter in Norton's long story with a twist in the tail, and also engineering that only happens when heritage meets tomorrow. That to me kind of suggests that the tech will have something unusual or innovative, and I was maybe expecting even an electric bike or a hybrid, maybe, but it doesn't look to have anything of the sort, and so perhaps there's a little bit of a surprise in store for us in terms of the technology, and I'd love to know if you've got any ideas down in the comments below. I'd probably rule out the electric side of things though. I mean, clearly the pictures show a V4, but also we reported in our news show just a few days ago that they've confirmed very recently that they're canning any electric superbike research or projects, owing to the fact that there's just no demand for them on the market. But yeah, as always, I'd love to know what you think of it, so do let me know down below. The current V4SV goes for about 40 grand, so do you think this is going to be similarly premium, or might they drop the price to, sub 30 or 25 grand to start to make it look more competitive with the Panigale or even bikes like the Aprilia RSV4. Also, what do you make of the new styling? Have they removed a bit too much of the character of the last generation and therefore made it a bit generic? Or is it a better looking bike that's a move in the right direction? I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the finished article, and so if you're not subscribed already, do hit subscribe to see all of our updates from EICMA in Milan. We're planning full coverage, as we do every year, and they're also expected to launch a number of smaller capacity machines, so we'll definitely be hitting up the Norton stand. In the meantime, I'll stick my review of the Commando on the screen as well, in case you haven't seen that. Another beautiful looking bike. As always, a massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.